The night was cruel. Snow fell in heavy sheets, mixing with freezing rain that stung against Isabel's skin like 1,000 tiny needles. She sat alone at the deserted bus stop, her thin coat soaked through, clinging to her shivering frame. Her hair was damp, strands sticking to her pale cheeks, and her eyes carried the weight of exhaustion that came from more than just the cold. It was the exhaustion of someone who had lost almost everything. Beside her sat a worn leather bag, the only possession she had managed to hold on to after her life had unraveled. And then, in the silence of that icy night, a small voice broke through. "Hi." Isabel lifted her head. Standing a few feet away was a little girl, no more than 5 years old, bundled in a pink winter coat and a woolen hat that was slightly too big for her. In her tiny mittened hand she held a cookie wrapped in a napkin. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold, and her smile carried a warmth so pure that it felt almost unreal in the frozen night. The girl stepped closer, extending her hand with the cookie. "You look hungry. You can have this." Isabel's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to protest, to say she couldn't take food from a child, but the girl's innocence disarmed her. With trembling fingers, she accepted the cookie, her throat tightening as she tried to hold back tears. The little girl tilted her head, studying her face with curious sincerity. Then, in a voice as soft as snow, but powerful enough to pierce Isabel's heart, she whispered, "You need a home, and I need a mommy." The words struck Isabel harder than the winter wind ever could. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The falling snow, the rushing traffic, even her own breath. She stared at the child, unsure if she had heard correctly, her heart aching at the purity of what had just been offered. And then, from a short distance, a man's voice called out, "Leia?" The little girl turned, smiling. A tall man in a dark coat approached quickly, his protective eyes shifting from his daughter to the stranger sitting at the bus stop. His presence was commanding, but not harsh. There was kindness beneath the concern in his gaze. This was Elliot. And in that fleeting moment, as the snow continued to fall, Isabel's broken path collided with his. A weary woman without a home, a little girl searching for a mother, and a father who had closed his heart long ago. None of them knew it yet, but their lives had just changed forever. Elliot's footsteps crunched in the snow as he reached the bus stop, his coat dusted white from the falling flakes. He placed a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder, gently pulling her close. "Leia, you can't just run off like that," he said softly, though his voice carried the unmistakable weight of worry. But Leia's tiny hand remained outstretched, pointing toward Isabel, who still sat hunched on the bench. Her big brown eyes shone with innocence. "Daddy, she's cold." Elliot followed her gaze, his eyes landing fully on Isabel for the first time. For a moment, he simply looked at her, the way her shoulders curled inward, the way her lips trembled for more than just the cold, the way she tried to avoid his eyes as though ashamed to even exist in his presence. Something inside him stirred, an echo of recognition, not of her face, but of the loneliness written across it. He cleared his throat, forcing his voice to remain even. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Isabel lifted her head slightly, her eyes glistening. She wanted to lie, to say yes, to preserve what little dignity she had left, but the truth pressed against her chest, heavy and unrelenting. She shook her head. No. Her voice was small, nearly lost beneath the howl of the winter wind. For a moment, Elliot hesitated. He was not a man who let strangers into his world. Life had taught him to be cautious, to build walls around himself and his daughter. But when Leia tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, please," those walls cracked. He exhaled, his breath visible in the frigid air. "There's a shelter not far from here. It's warm. I can take you there." Isabel's instinct was to refuse. Pride, fear, the ache of depending on anyone again. It all burned inside her. Yet her body betrayed her, too cold and too tired to keep pretending she was strong enough to endure alone. Slowly, she nodded. The walk to Elliot's car was quiet. Isabel kept her eyes down, clutching her bag as though it contained the last fragments of her existence. Laya, skipping a little ahead, turned back every few steps, her smile unshaken. Inside the car, the warmth of the heater washed over Isabel like a forgotten blessing. She pressed her frozen hands close to the vent, her eyes fluttering shut as heat seeped back into her bones. Elliot drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road, but every so often he glanced at the reflection of the woman in the rearview mirror, her fragile posture, the way she seemed to be holding the weight of the world inside her. They arrived at the shelter, a modest brick building glowing faintly against the dark winter night. Elliot parked, stepped out, and opened the door for her. Isabel hesitated at the entrance, her body half turned as if she might run, but then she caught Elliot's gaze. The child smiled up at her, whispering once more, "Don't be afraid. You're safe now." Something broke inside Isabel, not in pain, but in surrender. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, kindness still existed in the world. And though Elliot told himself this was nothing more than helping a stranger on a cold night, he couldn't shake the quiet voice in his chest, the one that wondered if fate had just placed someone in their path for a reason. The shelter was warm, yet Isabel felt like a stranger in its walls. The sound of murmured voices, the creak of old beds, the faint aroma of soup simmering in the kitchen, it all pressed against her senses like a world she didn't belong to. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot the volunteers had shown her to, her bag at her feet, her hands trembling in her lap. She had thought she would sleep instantly, but instead her eyes roamed the ceiling. The quiet of the night wasn't comforting, it was loud. Loud with memories of doors slammed, words hurled, nights spent praying for strength she never found. A tear slipped down her cheek, unbidden. She curled into herself, whispering, "Just one night, and then I'll figure something out." But across town, Elliot found no peace either. He tucked Lila into bed, brushing her hair gently away from her forehead. She blinked up at him sleepily. "Daddy, is she going to be okay?" Elliot hesitated. Children had a way of asking questions that pierced straight through the heart. "I don't know, sweetheart," he admitted, smoothing the blanket over her. But long after Lila's breaths deepened into sleep, Elliot sat by the window, staring out at the snow that continued to fall in soft waves. He told himself he shouldn't think about the woman at the bus stop. She was a stranger. Her life was not his responsibility. He had enough to protect already. Lila was his whole world, and letting anyone else in was a risk he wasn't sure he could take. And yet, against his will, her face lingered in his thoughts. The way she had sat, small and cold, trying to disappear from sight. The way she couldn't even bring herself to lie when he asked if she had somewhere to go. The way Lila had looked at her, not with pity, but with pure, unshakable kindness. The next morning at the shelter, Isabel woke to the sound of chatter and footsteps. Her body was heavy, her mind foggy from restless dreams. A volunteer offered her a tray with bread and tea, and she accepted it with a faint nod, whispering her thanks. Eating felt strange, almost guilty, like she was taking something she hadn't earned. She thought of slipping away, disappearing before anyone could expect more of her. But when she stepped outside, the cold struck her again, fierce and unforgiving. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and sat on the steps, staring at the snow-covered street. Her breath rose in clouds before her, and for the first time in years, she admitted to herself that she was scared. And in that fear, a fragile seed of something new took root. Not hope, not yet, but the quiet possibility that maybe she didn't have to keep surviving alone. The city awoke to a storm that seemed determined to bury everything beneath its weight. Snow fell not in flakes, but in sheets, whipped sideways by the howling wind. Streets were nearly deserted, cars lay abandoned at curbs, and the world seemed wrapped in a heavy, frozen silence. At the shelter, Isabel pressed her forehead against the frosted windowpane, watching the storm gather its fury. The cold seeped into her bones, despite the heater rattling nearby. She hadn't spoken much since arriving. Each day was a test of endurance: accept food without shame, sleep without drowning in memories, and somehow muster the strength to face another morning. But on this night, everything shifted. Across town, Elliot was pacing. Laya had gone to bed coughing, her small body burning with fever. He tried to convince himself it was just a seasonal cold, something she would sleep off, but the flush on her cheeks deepened, her breaths came shallow, and her coughs rattled through the quiet house like alarms. "Daddy!" Her voice was weak as she stirred in bed, her eyes glassy. "It hurts." Elliot's chest tightened. He rushed to her side, pressing a cool cloth against her forehead, whispering soothing words even as panic clawed at him. He picked up his phone to call the doctor, only to hear the line ring endlessly. The storm had knocked out services. Ambulances were delayed, roads nearly impassable. He sat back, helpless, clutching her small hand. For the first time in years, Elliot felt the full weight of being a single father, the loneliness of it, the fear of failing the one person who depended on him for everything. He would have traded every dollar he owned if it meant she could breathe easier in that moment. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Isabel startled when a volunteer burst through the door, flushed from the cold. "Does anyone know the young girl who was at the bus stop last night?" he asked, catching his breath. "She's been asking for Isabel." Her name on his lips froze her in place. Isabel's heart stuttered. Why would anyone be asking for me? The volunteer continued, "It's Elliot's daughter. She's sick, very sick. She keeps asking for the lady with the cookie." Isabel's chest tightened with something she couldn't name. Fear? Guilt? An ache that felt too big for words? She rose from her cot before she even realized it, clutching her thin coat around her. Within the hour, she was at Elliot's door again, the storm biting at her heels. Elliot looked startled when he opened it, torn between relief and disbelief. Why are you here?" he asked, his voice raw. Isabel hesitated, her own uncertainty flickering across her face. "They told me she was asking for me." And then, behind him, a small, broken voice called weakly from the bedroom, "Mommy?" The word hit them both like lightning, shocking, impossible, but undeniable in its tenderness. Elliot froze, and Isabel felt the ground shift beneath her feet. For the first time in a long time, someone was reaching for her, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but from the pure, unfiltered need of a child. And in that fragile moment, as the storm raged outside, 3 lives began to tangle together in a way none of them had ever expected. The storm didn't ease. It pressed against the windows like a living thing, sealing the world in silence. Inside Elliot's home, the warmth of the fireplace could not disguise the rising fear. Lila lay curled beneath thick blankets, her breathing shallow, her face pale as porcelain, her lips dry and cracked. Elliot knelt beside her, every muscle in his body wound tight with dread. He had faced investors, boardrooms, hostile takeovers, but nothing had ever broken him like the sight of his daughter's chest struggling for air. "Stay with me, baby girl," he whispered, brushing damp strands of hair from her forehead. His hand trembled. He couldn't lose her. Not her. Isabel stood nearby, her coat still clutched around her shoulders. She felt useless, a shadow in the corner of the room. And yet, when Lila's eyes fluttered open, they searched past her father, landing on Isabel. The weak smile that followed was enough to undo her. "You came back?" Lila whispered, her voice fragile as glass. Isabel's throat tightened. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her fingers lightly brushing the girl's hand. "Of course I did," she said softly, though inside she wondered, "Why me?" The answer came a moment later in the quiet desperation of a child's need. "Don't leave again." The doctor finally arrived, an older man who looked weathered by years of crises but not untouched by compassion. After a tense examination, he turned to Elliot, his expression grim. "She needs immediate treatment. Her lungs are fighting an infection, and with her condition, this could turn dangerous quickly. She'll need medication and—" He paused, lowering his voice. "Possibly a donor, if her body doesn't respond." The words fell like stones in Elliot's chest. "A donor?" The doctor nodded. "It's rare, but sometimes the immune system shuts down too hard. If that happens, she'll need a transplant. We'll test relatives first, but you should prepare yourself." Elliot's vision blurred. He nodded stiffly, unwilling to let his daughter see him falter. Later, when the doctor left to arrange tests, Elliot stepped into the hallway and pressed his forehead against the wall. His breath came ragged, his heart breaking. And then, he made his choice. If there was even the slightest chance his body could save hers, he would do it without hesitation. Business meetings, fortunes, his carefully constructed life. None of it mattered compared to her small hand gripping his. He returned to the room, calmer now, a man carrying the weight of resolve. Isabel looked at him, reading the storm behind his eyes. "What did he say?" she asked quietly. "That she needs me," Elliot replied, his voice steady but filled with a raw kind of love. "And I'll give her everything I have, even if it means—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Isabel understood. She saw the silent promise of a father ready to carve out his own life to keep her daughter's heart beating. For the first time since she'd met him, Isabel felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a powerful man in a beautiful home. This was a father willing to break himself for his child. She reached out without thinking, her hand brushing his arm. "You're not alone," she whispered. The words surprised her as much as they did him. But in that fragile instant, beneath the howl of the storm, a bond formed. Quiet, unspoken, but unbreakable. The days that followed were a blur of worry, medicine, and whispered prayers. The storm outside finally broke, leaving behind clear skies and a strange, tender calm that seemed to seep into the house itself. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air didn't smell of fear. It carried hope. Laya's fever slowly broke, her cheeks gaining back the soft pink that had drained away. Elliot barely left her side, sleeping in the chair near her bed, his head often resting against the mattress. Isabel helped in quiet ways, bringing water, reading aloud from Laya's favorite books, or simply sitting in the room so the child never felt alone. By the end of the week, laughter returned in small doses. Laya giggled at Isabel's silly voices while reading a story, and Elliot found himself smiling for the first time in months. The house no longer felt like a mansion of shadows. It breathed again, alive with warmth. And then came the day everyone had been waiting for, Laya's birthday. The staff decorated the living room with pastel balloons and ribbons, their faces glowing with relief. A cake, small and simple but made with love, sat on the table. Elliot insisted on carrying his daughter down himself, his arms steady, though his heart thumped with emotion. As everyone sang softly, Laia leaned against her father's chest, her smile brighter than any candle. When it was time to make her wish, the room fell silent. She closed her eyes, her lashes brushing her pale cheeks, and for a long moment no one breathed. Finally, she opened them and whispered, "I wish Isabel would stay with us, forever." The words hung in the air, delicate and yet heavy with meaning. Isabel froze, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to be needed in such a way. Elliot's eyes met hers over the flickering candles. There was no command in his gaze, no demand, only a question, and perhaps a hope. Isabel swallowed hard, her heart twisting. She had come here by accident, just a stranger caught in the storm. But now, sitting in this room filled with love, with the little girl looking at her as if she were the missing piece, she realized something had changed. She was no longer on the outside looking in. Somehow, this family had become hers too. Isabel reached across the table, her voice trembling but sure. "Then that's my wish too." Laia clapped her hands, beaming, and Elliot's shoulders finally eased. For the first time, the weight he had carried alone felt shared. The storm had taken much from them, but it had also given them something far greater. Not just survival, not just healing, but a new beginning.
We invite you to join Lightstories if this story strikes a chord with you, makes you smile, or stirs up strong emotions in you. Each story is meant to uplift, heal, and remind you of the beauty that comes from human connection. Share this story with someone who believes in kindness and second chances by clicking the subscribe button and turning on the notification bell. Keep your heart open till we cross paths again, because you never know when someone might ask, "Can I join you here?"